Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW. Do you need a web application security solution that can improve your detection rate and enable easier remediation? Acunetics has a fully automated solution that can detect and report over 4,500 web vulnerabilities. Fast and scalable, it can scan thousands of pages without interruption, including HTML5, JavaScript, and single-page applications. Acunetics provides accuracy with the lowest false positives by combining black box and white box testing. For more information, visit acunetics.com/Security Weekly.
Welcome back, everyone, to Application Security Weekly. A couple of quick announcements before we jump into the news. First, DerbyCon is holding its first ever mental health and wellness workshop put on by Amanda Berlin. So be sure to help support their efforts by going to derbycon.com/wellness. I'm actually going to be speaking in the workshop there on Friday morning. So come say hi if you're around. Also, join us for our webcast with Logarithm about tips and tricks for defending the enterprise using open source tools. That webcast will be held September 27th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. With that, Paul, Zane, what do you guys want to talk about this week? There's plenty of news to cover and a lot of interesting stuff going on with British Airways, of all places. I know we were just talking about flying earlier.
I wanted to start with Equifax. Is this article ever interesting? It's almost like Equifax made every single mistake that we've talked about on the show in the past 14 years. They made a good half a dozen of those most popular mistakes. Like, it goes so much deeper than just like not realizing that Struts was out of date and not fixing it before. I mean, that's the ideal situation that we just talked about, right? You're including I don't know if it's a library or a framework. We can debate that later maybe, but they included Strut. I called it I flirted with the idea of calling it a framework. I think the consensus it's a library. So they included the Struts library, and they didn't do those things we talked about in the previous segment, and started fixing it earlier. They incurred a lot of technical debt. But then if you read this article where all this a lot more information has come out, like they made every other mistake possible, not encrypting the data, lack of communication between the teams, which we also talked about, having that feedback loop. Like, as just, I think people think of it as one mistake, like, oh, we didn't patch Struts, and that's just one. There's probably a good 5 other solid things that they missed.
It's almost like the 3 Mile Island, nuclear power plant breakdown, right? It took a series of bad things going badly, I guess I would say, for this to end up as it was. And what was interesting to me is they gave you a timeline in the article that was linked under story number 1 for bugs, breaches, and more, which says, March 8th, 2017, Apache releases the CVE and the fix. US CERT on the same day is starting to warn companies that, it's starting to get security flaws out there and try to get the word out. And then 2 days after that US CERT advisory went live, it started detecting attacks, scanning servers for that particular vulnerability. Now, we saw, a recent Apache Struts vulnerability that came out. And if I recall, Zane, within like 24 hours, probably even less than that, from the POC going live, you guys at Signal Sciences already had a virtual patch out to help protect companies against this. It's amazing to me on 2 parts, right? First of all, that POC exploits and exploitation of this is happening in 48 hours. I mean, that's really fast these days. So, hats off to the reverse engineers out there. But secondly, that folks like you guys at Signal Sciences are being able to push out, virtual patching or protections for this. What does that actually look like on the Signal Sciences side?
Yeah, so I mean, the web sort of bugs like that, there's kind of the 2 sides to it, right? There's the way that we think about it anyway is there's the virtual patches for these sort of things. But under the hood, a lot of these are still, they're serialization issues, they're command execution bugs, they're SQL injection bugs, whatever. And so I think what this really speaks to is, look, the old way of protecting web apps was a big box full of signatures and regexes, right? And it's kind of like legacy AV. And so what you see that industry shift to is a more modern kind of approach, which is like the CrowdStrike, Cylance, Carbon Black model of let's deploy an agent that's pretty lightweight and intelligent, and let's have it get continuously smarter over time by talking to a back end that can get a real network effect. And the signal sciences side, we do the same thing on the web application space. So it's lightweight agent. You can deploy that, you can get coverage, and it talks to a SaaS backend so that it can continuously get smarter over time. And you're not trying to deploy something with just some signatures and some regexes that are always causing apps to break, and so you have to just put it in monitor mode. You can never actually get the thing into blocking mode. I think this is kind of the other major thing for blocking attacks at the web layer is the controls here have always been such a pain to ever actually get them into a practical blocking mode, that the dirty secret that we all live is that none of those things are ever put in blocking mode, right? Or you get 1 or 2 rules in blocking mode so you can show your compliance auditor that, and then as soon as they leave the room, you hope that they don't notice that everything else was in monitor mode. So really building technologies that can actually be used at scale in full blocking mode without having to go through the learning and the tuning bit is really, I think, the more underlying problem. And then individual CVEs on top become the symptoms of that, and being able to directly address those really effectively because you're in a blocking mode becomes the real solution.
And the telemetry that you generate too. I mean, one of the things that they talk about is this was taking place on the online dispute portal where the vulnerable version of Struts existed. And they had something like 9,000 queries that they used to gather the data, right? So when you start to see an abundance of queries going through in a short period of time, that by itself is a pretty good indicator of things going badly. And Paul, in a lot of ways, I think that what this comes back to in general is visibility and communication, right? So you cited, a couple of things going wrong in there. I don't know if you wanted to highlight some additional items or call outs that they had in the article, but there's definitely a number of things going wrong.
Yeah, and the initial notification that they sent to the IT ops and dev people missed sysadmins, like someone was missing from the list. So that was communication breakdown. Number one, the data inside the database had unencrypted usernames and passwords. That was mistake number 2. Missing some of those queries, the 9,000 queries was referenced in there as well. Failed to segment databases into smaller networks. There was a lot of things. The miscommunication was a big one, certainly. And also what I wanted to point out too is, I think historically, as I've seen these vulnerabilities released and exploits created and defenses created as well, is that anytime you've disclosed a vulnerability in popular software, typically I think what we need to brace ourselves for, especially today with the amount of bug bounty programs and attackers focusing more on applications, certainly, is that there's probably going to be another one, because now all these eyeballs are on Struts. And so attackers are what else is in there, right? Bug bounty is what else is in there? And then it becomes an arms race, right? Now, I think attackers and defenders in the arms race post initial vulnerability disclosure are kind of on the same playing field, right? Like the team at Signal Sciences and other vendors and teams and open source components are well, I know what the original vulnerability and exploit look like, so I can now tune it to this new one. And I think the attackers are on the same playing field. They're well, I know what the original exploit looked like. Now there's this new vulnerability. I can just tweak my code. I'm already familiar with the code base. So things are going to happen a lot more rapidly. As an enterprise defending an application, you need to know that and plan for it, right? That there's probably going to be something else there. Zane, I don't know if you can speak to the defenses between the different vulnerabilities.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head of that kind of arms race and everything like that. I mean, for all of us who lived through kind of the late 90s, early 2000s, and that arms race that went up of everything being directly connected to the internet, very few things actually firewalled off. Nobody had visibility into what was going on, and you could port scan entire networks and no one would even notice anything. I think the parallels between all the lessons learned on that, and we're starting to relearn those same lessons up at the app layer because that's where risk is shifted. It feels very comparable. I mean, the whole point of not noticing a whole bunch of stuff going on. First of all, I don't want to victim blame on this. This stuff is really hard at scale. I think that it was something that was always really interesting to me going from the pen test side, where we would come in and do pen test against folks' applications back when I was at ISEC and MCC. And one of the things that always stood out to me was that no one ever detected any of that. And that was really it bugged me more and more over time as I thought about it. And so then when I went in-house at Etsy and really started thinking about, okay, how would I detect an attacker behaving like some of my pen testers, right? How would I detect when someone's trying to discover and exploit an issue at the web layer, whether that's a web app or an API or microservice, whatever? and started to think through that. And the more that we thought through it, the more that we didn't like the answers that we actually had available, right? The only thing we had there were the legacy WAFs. And so we really started to invest in that and build out on that side. And this is really where, to Keith's point, now kind of going forward to the Signal Sciences bit, and I don't want to do a vendor pitch here. So I'll say, like, look, Signal Sciences is one of these, but just thinking about this area in general, it's thinking that as risk goes up to the application layer, starting to get that visibility so that, when there's the 9,000 bits of actually refining an exploit payload or doing some exfil at the web layer is going on. I think it's a really hard thing at scale today, and most organizations really can't answer that question. And so I think because risk is shifted, it's where we're starting to shift our defensive focuses as well.
And one of the other things as well is they point out here that they were using standard encrypted web protocols to disguise the exchanges as normal network traffic. But to some extent, your web server should be, connecting on port 80, 8080, 443, or what have you, right? But should it be connecting back out to things? Like, is anybody actually browsing from the web server itself out on port 80 or port 443, right? Et cetera. And so it's almost like looking for patterns and behavior of the server itself, right? If that server had never connected outbound before on port 443, in this case is what it sounds like, and suddenly it starts doing that after these kind of requests are coming in, that's by itself a good signal to actually start taking a look and say, should this thing be talking outbound? Like, most of the time, no, I would hope.
Yeah, and that's, as Zane said, still hard to do at scale, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, maybe another thing for Signal Sciences is a method of detection, right? Is this thing talking outbound on things that it shouldn't be talking outbound on? So,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, any other thoughts, guys, on this article? I know that we got plenty to talk about here, so I'm happy to move on if you guys are.
No, yeah, let's talk about Task Scheduler.
Oh, yeah. So the Microsoft Windows 0 Day. This was actually the one that was put out on Twitter as a 0 day. It's not such a bad deal in my mind because, again, it requires you to have access to the box in some way. So maybe it's a phishing attack or what have you that allows you to do privesc. What I found interesting about this, let me just go to my highlighted notes here, was, first of all, it was a flaw rated between 6.4 and 6.8 on CVSS, so people are probably never going to patch it, for one. But that it also exists on Windows 10. Yay, which, again, maybe a lot of people probably aren't on yet. But 64-bit Windows 10 and Windows Server 2016 are both, exploitable with this. And then there's some speculation in here that it could be backported to Windows 7, which I'm sure a lot of companies are still on. And I believe is end of life or is coming end of life soon, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I don't know. Zane, did you take a chance to look at this? I mean,
I didn't get the chance to see the details on this one, so I unfortunately don't really have that much to add here. Not that I've necessarily added that much to the whole conversation, but I think I have even less to add on this one.
I mean, it is desktop related, which I thought was interesting. So it looks like, I don't know the call itself, but from what I could tell, Paul, it looked like it was in SCH RPC set security to alter permissions as part of like almost like an API, right? So that API itself, or advanced local procedure call, would allow it to then go ahead and use functionality to abuse different systems inside of Microsoft's subsystem. To that end, yeah, Microsoft isn't really my forte as much either, but when I saw this, especially because it was publicly disclosed on Twitter of all places, I thought, yeah, no, not cool, especially because guess what? It's essentially an API function, which, by the way, most people don't do a very good job securing their APIs because nobody thinks, how could somebody misuse this API? It's just fine.
I also think there's a tie into the mental health and wellness seminar at DerbyCon. Is if you read the initial tweet, it is kind of disturbing, and I'm sure it'll be discussed at DerbyCon this year, as it was anonymously disclosed on Twitter, which kind of blew my mind as well. I mean, if you read into what they wrote in the tweet, it's interesting and very concerning. But also I question, like, why didn't they submit to a bug bounty program? I mean, Microsoft has a bug bounty program for their operating systems specifically. They likely would have paid someone for this. You could have gone a number of different routes rather than publicly disclosing it on Twitter, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, good point as well. And it is one of those things that from reading the thread, you make a good point. It was a situation where it seemed like basically they were being ignored and trying to bring this forward, and then ultimately they just probably disclosed it as kind of like a big, giving the middle finger to Microsoft for not doing anything about it. Interestingly, the researcher did come back and say, this isn't on Microsoft, this was on me at one point. And so I thought that was also kind of owning up to it. And yeah, I mean, honestly, when people get burnt out, when they work really hard on something, they find something that is important and valuable, and then it just gets kind of, poo-pooed. People get pissed, and then sometimes they do things that are irrational. So yeah, I'm sure the Wellness Village will have some discussions around, keeping cool and not getting burnt out. Like those are kind of two really valuable things. So yeah, absolutely will be a discussion. Mine is on time management, ironically, but I think that is like a hopefully stopping burnout to some degree, or at least allowing you not to hit that point. So
yeah, no, that's a good point too. Yeah. So what happened at British Airways cross-site scripting?
This one was, in my opinion, pretty good. So basically what ended up happening was they were alerted by a researcher, a security researcher of all people, about GDPR, basically compliance-related issues based on some of the JavaScript code that it had on its website related to privacy, third-party aggregation of data, analytics, A/B testing, etc. So security researcher Mustafa Al-Bassam basically put forward that, hey, you are actually potentially violating GDPR with this, so you got to clean up your JavaScript code. Well, they go and clean up their JavaScript code, and supposedly, at least according to the article, there was no iframe isolation of the payment card fields, which would leave it vulnerable to cross-site scripting. Now, we don't know for sure that it was cross-site scripting. I could feasibly see that someone could potentially create a cross-site scripting request that allows the attack to then be sent, or the data to then be sent to another location. But I don't know. I mean, to me, it could be something else. Zane, do you have any additional thoughts on this? I mean, you guys see cross-site scripting, SQL injection, all that kind of stuff all day long.
Yeah, and actually even just putting my Etsy hat back on from years ago, I only got to see part of the details of this, so this could be fair warning that this could be totally off. From what I saw, it looked like it was 380,000 records, and it was for a very specific time window. And what it seemed like actually kicked this off was, like you were saying, them taking a look at some of the JavaScript libraries and maybe pulling one of those out. My gut reaction to that was, and again, this is talking about probability, not possibility, but that felt like one of the libraries in use might have been misconfigured, and it was accidentally leaking info, which if you talk to any web shop, they've had this issue happen to them more times than probably anybody can count. Where if you deal with the production web applications, you've had misconfigured analytics services or misconfigured logging services or anything like that you don't notice until you're looking for some other issue, and then realizing that it's actually been logging data that you did not expect that it was logging. And so depending on your reporting requirements out of that might have actually then driven, we have to actually report this as a compromise of data, because that's kind of, a mass number of records via a cross-site scripting doesn't feel like the most probable one to me. It feels like more like, some third-party service was misconfigured. But again, we're talking about probabilities, not all of this is possible. So.
What was interesting about this is they did highlight in the article that basically, if cross-site scripting is a possibility in your application, you immediately fail the PCI requirements for basically being PCI compliant. And so what I thought was kind of crazy about this is the fact that, okay, you're not protecting the iframe, so you can have, the potential for injection is that, you're not protecting the data that is coming in because of your failure to actually isolate iframes. But that doesn't necessarily mean they were out of compliance up until they updated, as Zane pointed out, possibly one of the configurations, or maybe they just forgot to include a library prior that was doing some sort of sanitization of the inputs, right? So yeah, I mean, this could have been SQL injection. It could have been cross-site scripting. It makes sense from some degrees that it could be cross-site scripting, but 380,000 records in that short a period of time, it's either SQL injection, people walking out the door with it, or misconfigured analytics that was leaking data of other users potentially on the site. And to that end.
Or you could have like a malicious library here, but if that's the case, then this should impact a lot of other sites. So unless it was a library that only they were using, like a third-party library that only they were using. But again, kind of dealing in probabilities here. Either if it was a malicious library, it should impact a lot of people. If it was a cross-site scripting, you don't generally see it as hundreds of thousands of records. But a misconfigured library, a misconfigured like third-party service that was running for about a month before someone noticed it was misconfigured, I think that has happened to almost every enterprise on the planet. So in my mind, that feels like a more probable. But again, we're all kind of going off of very limited scraps of what's public here. So
I think what this highlights more than anything, though, is the idea that you do not want to be doing development under duress, right? So this was a situation where it looked like they reacted perhaps a bit knee-jerk in their way that they said, "Oh, GDPR, compliance potential violation here. Got to fix this right now, today. Like, don't go to sleep. Get this done." That's a situation that is ripe for such situations as this to end up being the case. And so again, having good protections in place to make sure that you're getting good telemetry, that you're blocking appropriate traffic as it comes through, and request types that come through is going to save you a lot when it comes to, okay, you need to update this soon, or we can take out maybe some of this telemetry and replace it. But then you also have to go back and make sure it's configured correctly. Otherwise, there's no protection in the world that can protect you from leaking data just by a misconfigured JavaScript library, in my mind.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think I just failed vendor school there, seeing as how we sell a vendor product to protect web apps, and I did not want to pitch us there at all. Yeah, I mean, I think this is, look, at the web scale stuff, you have issues like this all the time. And exactly as you said, Keith, like, how do you get visibility into it? How do you get protection over it? And a lot of times it's things like what I was putting forth there, which is a lot of times your third-party services aren't configured the way that you think that they are, and you don't notice it until something else goes on.
Where do you want to go next, Paul?
Wherever you want to go. I think I was pretty...
All right.
Well, no, do you want to jump around? Like, the Docker hacking challenge?
So this was kind of cool. I didn't jump too deep into it myself, but this was a hacking challenge put together by, let's see, I had it here, Not So Secure Global Services. So
I think they've had this for a while, Keith. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and so this was one that they announced on September 4th, so it is a few weeks old, but there was a nice article around a vulnerable Docker virtual machine that they put together a challenge for. So basically it's, hey, we are offering you the opportunity to actually hack a Docker container or hack your way out of it. And there was two levels, right? There was kind of the easy mode and the hard mode. And the hard mode was escaping the container. So there were multiple sets of flags. In fact, I believe they actually trained at a course at Black Hat this year. So, or the idea came out of it. So this was kind of cool. It was learning and tools number 3. Which, I mean, for me and you, Paul, we're both Docker fanatics. And so in my mind, it's like, okay, cool. Do they have a web application on there? Is it protected by anything like Signal Sciences? Probably not. And then, from there, can I throw malicious activity at it? Can I actually break out of the container? I haven't played with it yet, but it looks like it's going to be fun and interesting for a lot of our listeners, especially if you're on the dev side and you're looking to get a little bit of practice in being a hacker.
Now, it could be that I'm just not looking in the right places, but I haven't seen a lot of research around Docker escape vulnerabilities. I don't know if you folks have seen a lot on that front. I have not seen a lot on that front.
I mean, to that end, they do a really good job in actually protecting the kernel space. And if you think about the way that Docker actually works, right? So it shares effectively the kernel calls back to your native operating system rather than having that hypervisor layer in place, which is what translates virtual machines down to, native, the native actual calls to your operating system. And so I imagine what they're probably doing here is they're making use of some sort of deprecated kernel call that's still in place on your operating system that maybe isn't used anymore by your operating system, but rather than take it out and potentially break everything, they kind of leave it in place as a do not use. So my guess is that's probably what it's doing is actually doing some sort of deprecated calls to the kernel that allow it to then escape out of the actual Docker environment itself.
Well, it's interesting. You're theorizing that Docker container escapes likely could stem from Linux kernel vulnerabilities rather than vulnerabilities in Docker itself.
Yeah, I mean, potentially. In my mind, Docker really is just a super thin layer that contextualizes everything in a way that it just kind of maps all of those bindings together in a contained environment, right? It's at a high level, I think that it's because of the sharing with the kernel space that's more likely the actual escape, right? Because it's almost like its own hypervisor in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
Zane, I don't know if you had anything to add. I know that I'm a bit of a Docker nut, so.
No, man, you answered that far better than I ever could.
Right on, right on. So other than that, I did want to make sure, because a couple of weeks ago, Paul, we talked a little bit about WebAssembly. And Zane, you might be interested in this as well. So food for thought number 2 is actually an article on discussing Go and WebAssembly. Now, I did a little bit of research after we spoke last time, because in my mind, what I said didn't feel quite right in terms of delivering binaries across the internet. WebAssembly, in effect, is a web standard similar to the ideas of JavaScript that defines a binary format and corresponding assembly-like text format that your browser can render. So it's almost like your browser becomes a compiler. Which I thought was interesting and scary, because we know how embedded the JavaScript engine is into the browser. But I don't know, Paul or Zane, what do you guys think of suddenly being able to deliver effectively assembly-like code via the browser to users? I mean, talk about like the browser now becomes your malware potentially, in my mind. What are your guys' thoughts?
I was waiting for Zane if he wanted to jump in, but we recently had a conversation, and it was Joff that it stuck in my mind. We were on Paul Security Weekly, and he posed the question, how much do you trust your compiler, right? Because the security of your code, a lot of it depends on the security and integrity of your compiler. And so that this would beg the same question for me, as Joff pointed out last week on Paul Security Weekly.
Yeah, I don't have much on this one because I haven't gotten to actually look into this technology at all yet. Sounds super interesting. I think the question then becomes, if we're doing the compiler comparison, does this actually go out of the browser and down to the OS at all? Is this is it focused more on kind of performance of more efficiently transmitting kind of data or HTML or anything for the presentation layer or application layer inside the web apps, and it just wants to transmit more efficiently? So we're going down from text down to binary to send that across. Like, what are the design goals for this? And then I think that starts to inform, like, okay, what are our security risks and what are our security goals for it?
Yeah, and also, as Zane was talking too, like what protections are in that compiler that offer security, right? Are there security features that are in the compiler you can take advantage of, so your code is just inherently more secure because of compiler features?
So what it ends up being is it is a binary instruction format for a stack-based virtual machine. So it's almost like it's virtual, like the browser is a virtual compiler is maybe the way that they're going for it, because you can now provide binary instructions in languages like C, C++, Rust, and Go that the browser can understand and then efficiently and quickly, because again, C, C++, etc., right? If you were sending across effectively like a C program as opposed to, a full-featured web application, the C program is usually a lot smaller and a lot faster. And so now it's just basically saying, okay, you've got this stack-based virtual machine inside of your browser that actually does all of the quote-unquote compilation and then rendering from your browser outward. In my mind, and as the article kind of goes into, it democratizes the entire web space, right? Because now, if you're not a JavaScript developer, which, by the way, today, if you're doing anything front-end and even some back-end, you're probably a JavaScript developer of some kind. But for everybody else that's writing in Go, perhaps even someday Python, C, C++, etc., maybe not Python just because of the whole binary instruction format, but who knows, right? It could happen. You now have the ability to actually serve out application and application functionality to your end users that is now performant at near native speeds to your computer, right? It's almost as if it was installed. So in my mind, I don't know that it has had really as much of a security review as we might hope. I mean, it's already in at least version 1.0 of the WebAssembly formats for Firefox, Chrome, Safari, and Edge. So, if anyone's doing it right, it's probably Chrome and also likely Firefox that are actually doing a really good job of this, because guess what? That's kind of like their main focus. But yeah, it's under development now, and for me, I'm both a little bit frightened because of what it can do, and at the same time somewhat excited because now I can actually write C++ or Go, and instead of having to learn JavaScript. So I don't know. That's where my mind is at with it.
Yeah, this seems super interesting. It's definitely a technology I'm interested in taking a look at and learning some more about.
And last one I wanted to cover, well, before the comic book anyway, or the commit strip comic, was an actual article by Nathan. Nathan on Security is what he goes by on Twitter, I believe, on mental health and bug bounties. And so this one I think was interesting because doing bug bounty hunting in my free time myself, the whole idea of, when you're doing bug bounties, a lot of people are like, okay, I need to get out there, I need to make money, I want to do this full time. But the stress that comes along with it. And I think that, the translation there is similar to any of the jobs that we do, right? For me, it's, okay, I need to produce more tooling to make teams better at security. And I could do that 24/7 by 365 and still only touch the surface of that iceberg. Whereas in this case, he talks specifically about self-care and taking time to actually, drink a glass of water, go out for a walk. I don't know, Paul or Zane, you probably experienced this. How many times have you run into a bug in your code that, it's late at night, you're working on it, you can't figure it out, you eventually just give up and go to bed, and then you wake up somewhere in the middle of the night and you have the answer? Like, has that ever happened to you guys?
Pretty much every time.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, so
I'm more shocked when there's a really big bug that figured out when it's not either in bed in the middle of the night or in the shower in the morning. Like, that's when all bugs get solved for me.
Right? Yeah.
Sam makes fun of me because a lot of my ideas, I'll be like, I was in the shower, and she's like, I'm really nervous about what you're going to say next. But a lot of my good ideas come to me in the shower.
Yeah, it's amazing what taking your mind away from it for a little while can do. And I think that Nathan points out, sometimes really stepping away from the problem for a little while and, going and enjoying life can both help you financially if you're, doing bug bounty hunting for money, but also from that area of just being successful at finding a bug. Maybe it was a duplicate, but hey, you found a real bug and you hacked a real thing. So it's, yet another skill that you can start to work on or can qualify. So I thought that was a good article. For those that haven't read it, it's a Medium article, Food for Thought number 3 under the wiki. Last one, I'm not going to give too much away here, but Paul or Zane, did you guys get a chance to check out story number 4 under Food for Thought, which is the commit strip article?
Hilarious. They hit on every single piece of technology in buzzword. It's hilarious. Make sure you check it out.
Basically, the synopsis here is developer is looking for a job, or at least is working with a recruiter. Recruiter comes back with pretty much everything that they want, and then developer is like, no, but I want all these newfangled things because I want to learn and grow. And it's just they pretty much hit on every buzzword possible. But anyway, with that, thank you everyone for joining us this week for another episode of Application Security Weekly. Remember to git, commit, and stay classy.